I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Sterling.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
So today is a beautiful day and we're looking at the rest, I guess, of this chapter of looking at the Age of Mobilisation. Charles Taylor's introducing this idea of, well, let's actually track the history so we can see what's actually in play. So today we're going to jump right in and try and cover 1800 to 1950, 1960. So we're taking a good chunk of history here, maybe 150 years.
If you've been listening to this podcast, you might actually feel like we're going back over old ground, and it's true, we are, because we have already talked about some of this probably in more detail. So we're going to zoom back out a little bit and track the 1800s to the 1960s or so from a bit further out, a bit of a, what does he call it? An outrageously simplified potted history.
And in another very Taylorism, even going through the circles and then coming out and going back in, he starts off talking about the Age of Mobilisation by talking about what came before. So that has a French name, so I'm going to hand over to my French expert.
I am not a French expert. In fact, I'm hating looking at, I'm like, if I was trying to say this in French, how would I say it? L'ancien régime. Anyway, let's call it the ancient regime, because that's an English sort of equivalent. And he's equating this with the 18th century. But if you've been listening all along, you could probably say this is a generalization of where we've come from, even since the beginning of the book. This idea of, in Western Europe, the general thing was a hierarchical order in the church and the state. And even by the 18th century, he's pointing out, this is still what is largely in place in the church, politically speaking, and that this is seen by the general population as grounded in God's will. That God has set up this way of things being, this is the way it should be, it's always been this way, it's always going to be this way. That people live in local communities, they worship in local communities, and they receive their identity out of this space of, I'm born here, this is the faith that we collectively practice. We celebrate together, we worship together, we mourn together. And it's still somewhat, if you've been listening all along, somewhat an enchanted world. For the general population, there's still this sense of, we do this because there's spirits that we want to ward off or that we want to invite or whatever. But Charles Taylor wants to point out that by the 18th century, that's only the general population, and that there's an elite sitting at the top who have sufficiently developed in a different direction that there's now a cultural divide, if you like, that the collective faith or ritual of faith that is enacted still by everybody is very differently understood by those who are higher up, like more educated, if you like, and that there's basically change waiting to happen because the elite have moved on in their thinking. They've come to a space of disenchantment where they're not affected or experiencing the transcendent as breaking into their world in the same kind of way. And they've come to an understanding of the world and the goodness of the world and the goodness of the human person, which doesn't have a need for God. So there's change waiting to happen at this point.
Yeah, and Taylor would say exactly around 1800, you've got the mass who are living in the ancient regime and the elite who are starting to shift into unbelief. And he's saying the next 150 years is where we'll see, by mid-20th century, widespread secularization. So he's saying kind of the vehicle that society travels through in the West for this transition is the time of age of mobilisation. And there's a lot of factors that play into this, but think urbanization, think industrialization, where people are moving from those villages that they worshipped and lived in and their whole life worked in into the cities. And so they've now separated from that thing that's held them. So they're prime, they're ripe for something, and that something is going to be whatever can be organized to draw them into that. There's a real freedom that comes with this time because it's like possibilities are now open. If you can imagine it, you can create it. And if you can find the people to support you in that, then, you know, we can make this thing happen. And so we've seen some of the belief in the power of humanity really starts to take hold in this period of time, that we've seen that, you know, if we work hard enough, if we get enough people behind this cause, we can make anything happen. And so Taylor kind of gives us a couple of ideas of the ways that the ancient regime and the age of mobilisation are different. So the first of those being that the ancient regime was related to the cosmos, that sense of order, that everything is, as Kat was saying, ordered by God. It's ordained by God to be this way, and there's a harmony and a complementarity in the hierarchy that's there. Whereas in the age of mobilisation, we've shifted to the universe. We've shifted to the modern moral order, where we're now ordered by our sense of mutual benefit and things like that we've talked about before, that society is much more about like each man for himself, and that is actually what's going to help society grow. If we're all being industrial and we're all, you know, pursuing what's good for us, that'll be good for all of us together, rather than you having a set place that you kind of got to stay in the hierarchy. The second, and this is really interesting, is that the ancient regime, you were born into a structure, into a society, into something. So what you came into pre-existed you. Whereas in the age of mobilisation, you're trying to bring about something that doesn't exist yet. And so the society that you're living in is being made in real time with real-time human decision and agency. So rather than this is where I'm slotting in and I know where I am, age of mobilisation, suddenly things are only happening if we make them happen. And there's a lot of excitement that comes with this of, I've got freedom, I don't need to worry about, you know, I'm freely choosing what we are, what we're becoming, and it's all happening very fast, real time.
And there's something like, if you look at the history of the shift of that, you can see there's a sense of empowerment as they realize, you know, one person starts to question the church and other people follow, and they create a reformation, and there's change in the church. The power of people creates the French Revolution. Ordinary working people who question the status quo and band together can make changes to things that people had once thought could never be shaken, never be changed. And so there's this sense of empowerment of, we can do it if we band together.
Yes. So the third element, I guess, of the difference between these two is that in that ancient regime, I kind of had mediated access. So I was connected to the parish, and then the parish priest was connected to the bishop, was connected to the pope. So I kind of, like at a faith level, it was all mediated like that. I was connected to village, which was connected to the wider sense of kingdom. So that, like, I didn't have direct access in. Whereas in the age of mobilisation, I'm a free agent who has capacity to directly access the group that I'm going to for belonging, or the place where I'm going for worship, that I am now have a lot more power and direct connection rather than it being mediated by levels of hierarchy. And the last, as Kat was saying, was this difference between the enchanted world and the disenchanted world. So by the time we get to the age of mobilisation, there's this real sense that I've left behind popular religion and superstition, and some of that kind of stuff has started to be undone, and now I can just get practical about the things that need to be done for society. So one of the things that's going to be really powerful in this time is that we've gone from, as I was saying, you're born into belonging, to now you have to kind of opt in, and not only have to, but you kind of get to. There's a joy and a freedom about this. So, Kat, you were saying before off air about, because we were kind of talking about the difference between, well, faith is still an opt-in thing now. So how is it different to what was happening in Age of Mobilisation? And you made a really good point about how they've come from something so strong and clear in their village life that when they come to the city, they're feeling the lack. There's a void that they're looking to be filled.
Yeah. So can you imagine the experience of having it all there for you, your faith, your place in society, your sense of belonging, not just to a family or a church, but to the world in general. Like it's sort of organic in that village, local place culture of the ancient regime. You disembed somebody from that, bring them to the city for an industrial job, and there's like more people than they can count. You don't have a local community who you know all the people. So you have this sense of almost alienation or lostness without a community around you. So even like you might bring your faith, I still believe in God, but like turning up to Mass on Sundays doesn't seem to feel that sense of everything that I've lost or left behind. There's a whole collection of stuff that goes not just with what I believe in my head and my heart, but the whole living experience that I've come from that's missing. And so you can imagine that people are then consciously or unconsciously reaching out for a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of embedding myself somewhere, having a community around me, people who I share life with, a sense of where I fit in society, in the world. And so into that space, you then have all these things maybe that present themselves as options. There's my local trade union, there's a coffee club down the corner, there's this devotion on a Wednesday night, there's this social action group, all these different things presenting themselves, looking for my involvement. And with involvement and commitment, I gain a community. I gain a sense of I belong not to this parish, but to the St. Vincent de Paul Society within this parish. And that's my local community. We meet every Thursday night and we go out and we visit the poor. And, these people have become the people I share life with. They've given me a sense of direction and purpose with the time outside my physical working hours.
Yeah. So what we've got is a very ripe population, which the way it unfolds in history is with this, the Age of Mobilisation. They're ripe. They're taken away from something that held them in, as you were saying, not just in their faith, but in their purpose, in the world, their connection to society, all of that they're taken away from. And so they're sitting there waiting. And the rise of denominations, the very nature of a denomination is that it's got to get people on board because they're all emerging in this time. And there's lots of different ways that we see this, of different denominations trying different things to get people on board, to build the cause, to find what it is people are hungry for, and to be meeting that need, because you have to keep people in a denomination if you want to keep the denomination alive.
Fascinating, actually. I don't think I'd ever thought about that. But Charles Taylor pointing out that, in the ancient regime, there was only one church, if you like. There wasn't a choice about it, and people didn't question that there was the faith, and you worshipped in the way that everyone around you worshipped. But at the same time as this great disembedding, this migration into the cities, there's that Nova effect we've talked of, where there's all these different ways of believing. And so people move to the city and there's all these things clamoring for their attention, if you like. You could believe in this way or you could worship in this way. But it's the first time that you have anything approaching a denomination, even in people's thinking.
Yeah. And you brought up an interesting point there around, say, St. Vincent de Paul, because one of the other things that's going to happen in this time is that I'm not so affiliated to my direct local parish, as there starts to be what I think as Taylor calls it translocal, things that are beyond the local. So we get, for example, the rise of Lourdes happens in this period where we start to get a pilgrimage site and people start becoming devoted to that, or the rise of the devotion to the Sacred Heart. So it doesn't matter where I am, but I can be connected through a devotion to a site or to a particular devotion or a particular group that extends beyond that immediate local community.
Which means that if I move across the city, rather than just looking, oh, where's the nearest place I can go to Mass, there's does this local parish have a St. Vincent de Paul group or a Sacred Heart prayer group or something like that, because that's where I feel I belong within the church. And it's partially the product of big inner city churches with so many people that it's not even really possible to feel like you have a community around you without something like that.
And so, as I said, we'll get to in the coming episodes looking at what comes after the Age of Mobilisation, because that is called the Age of Authenticity, and that sits between the Age of Mobilisation and us. There's this section in the middle. So without stepping too far forward, we just started to think about, well, actually, there's still traces of the Age of Mobilisation now, and even without looking forward, we can still see traces of this now. And I think we kind of talked about, like, one of the reasons we started this podcast in some ways was because the way that you evangelize in that age is very different to the way that you evangelize now. But I could see a lot of things that didn't seem to quite be hitting the mark because they weren't meeting, the current need, the current society, the way things were. And I think someone once explained the Catholic Church to me as a bit like a really big ship that takes a long time to turn around. So I think sometimes the denominations that are smaller can kind of shift more quickly as a small little boat. But I think sometimes the Catholic Church in particular as a whole can take a bit of time to redirect its course. And so we can look at that down the line, but I think there's some things here that are worth looking at. And one of the things is that the sense of commitment and belonging over this time begins to change. And we know that it's going to change more with the Age of Authenticity. But this sense that all you've got to do is mobilize people into action, all you've got to do is find the thing that they need and give them that place of belonging. One of the other things that we didn't mention, but that happens in this time is, as I was saying, that there was a fear of social disorder. One of the things that happens in the Age of Mobilisation is that, particularly from a clerical perspective, is like, well, we've got to bring in order. And so this sense around having the right practice and doing the right things kind of comes into place, so that I would say even that's how, I was evangelized as a kid was do the right things, which has less effect over time because there's other things at place in the world.
I think the thing that, just thinking about that image of the church as a very big ship that is needing to turn around, I think one of the things that Charles Taylor has given me is some language and ability to understand that. I mean, even this whole book, he's clear that we're talking about Western society, whereas with the Catholic Church necessarily is about the whole of the world. And so when we, every now and again, we'll talk about the experience we have of talking to sisters who've grown up in different cultures. And I can clearly hear in listening to them that they're still, or their culture is still living in an enchanted world. So one of the things that, like, I've noticed in the church in Australia, because we're such a migrant culture and there are waves of people continually moving here from other countries, is that we have people moving here from cultures who haven't experienced the same sort of trajectory as Western society. And even like if you read this chapter in Taylor's book, he traces the American experience and the French experience and the British experience, and they all look different from each other. So we have Christians coming into Australia from Africa and Asia and other parts of the world, and their whole experience is a different one again, and looks more like, or the church in those cultures looks more like what I would describe as something similar to Age of Mobilisation, ways of organizing, or ways of, I don't know how you would say it, approaching
and
evangelization.
that's it. We kind of are only studying the Western case. So I don't even know what the language is for that, because they haven't been through the same trajectory as the West. But I was even thinking, just in the last couple of years in Australia, the rise of rallies, particularly with things going on in the Middle East, like as a historical cultural society, Australia has come out of the Western mindset. But actually, there's a coexisting of so many different, trajectories that are all converging. And for that reason, I think there's a lot of confusion or just tension as these different things are coming in together. And so things that might look very much like the Age of Mobilisation as we would understand it, of organised groups trying to get people on board to bring about change and action, to bring about a place of belonging and things like that, is also then conflicting with, a whole society that's, a long way down the track in terms of age of authenticity, all kind of trying to do life together. Like, it's a very interesting place, and we often talk, it's almost 20 years now since Charles Taylor brought this out, and I think the world has changed a lot in those 20 years.
Yeah, it has. But it's interesting, like, just to make what we're talking about more concrete, one of the groups we have a fair bit to do with here in Melbourne, and it's one of the most long-running and strongest young adults groups around here in Melbourne. Like, I remember nearly 20 years ago when I first moved to Melbourne, they were going strong, and they're still going strong now. Is a group called COSDU, Catholic Overseas Students Down Under. And they have this amazing and beautiful outreach to overseas students. And I think they've actually changed their name recently, so it doesn't sound so exclusive. But the reality is that they are 95% overseas students who belong to this group. And it's not because local Australian young people aren't into their faith. It's because they come from a different, I guess Charles Taylor would say social imaginary, really, wouldn't he? A whole different way of conceiving or experiencing the world around them. And so they're looking for a place of belonging, and the sort of organization mindset still works for them in a way that you can use all the same principles to organize a group and try and recruit young Australian young adults, even young Australian young adults who are into their faith, and have minuscule levels of success in comparison, because they're just living in a different mindset, a different social imaginary, as Charles Taylor would say.
It's kind of equivalent to what we were talking about of the country dwellers moving into the city, that transition, and then there's a void, and what's going to fill the void. We're experiencing a lot of that in Australia, where even if they're not directly from overseas, but they're from migrant families that still have that mindset, they get to university and, they're prime. So the Victorian government, starting last year, moving into this year, has been doing a whole commission on effectively like Christian cults, particularly in Melbourne. I don't know why, but there's a huge problem with whatever it is that's going on in Melbourne, the ripeness of the international students, where they will just go on campus, find those people that are looking for that, and they've got sitting ready, waiting for them, the belonging, the meaning, the purpose, the connection, all of that thing, like the pseudo family, the pseudo everything waiting for them. And people are getting sucked in without even realizing, that they're part of what would be considered a cult, because it's got all the hallmarks of what they're looking for. And so it's a very fascinating situation where it's like, how do you discern, like the right level. And that's one of the things that I think is going to come out of this commission. It's very difficult to discern the difference between something that's really life-giving and something that looks like it's really life-giving. And, like, to be able to define the difference between, say, a COSDU and one of these cults moving through the university would be very difficult to distinguish on paper.
I guess when I think about it, it's one of the complexities of living and working as a missionary in the church today, especially in Australia, is that you're actually working with two different realities. I mean, one of the things that got us into this podcast and into this book was the question of how do you reach out to young people from what we'll start talking about probably in the next podcast, from the age of authenticity, like what's different. But you do still have to engage with the fact that because we are a migrant society, we still need to have under our belt or in our belt the tools for the age of mobilisation. Like our parishes, particularly I've noticed when I was living in Sydney, in Western Sydney, our parishes are full of people who organise and volunteer and commit like the age of mobilisation. And it's great. It's, if you're looking for people to do things in a parish, be a missionary in Western Sydney. I recommend it. People are motivated. They turn up to working bees and that kind of thing. Whereas you try it using those same tools with young adults who've grown up in this age of authenticity that we've moved into largely as a society, and you will be constantly frustrated and feel like you're getting nowhere because things have shifted so much.
There's a lot that we will talk about in the coming weeks, which, like, I love it. We're getting closer and closer to home. But I think something that I want to land on today is that almost, how things tend to come back around. So, like that age of mobilisation, belonging and commitment was really important. And then we're going to go through this age of authenticity where, people want to opt in, have freedom and choice and all that kind of thing. But what we're going to see then is this countercultural movement of commitment. And we are part, as missionaries of God's Love Sisters, we're part of a broader lay covenant community called Disciples of Jesus. And on Sunday, we just had, within a parish, actually, a whole bunch of young families that were living parish life said, actually, we want to be more committed. So they popped up and contacted us and said, we want to be part of Disciples of Jesus because we're looking for something. We can see that there's a quality that's different when you commit. You can be doing the same things. You can be turning up and having praise and worship or meeting for sharing group and all those kinds of things, but we can see that there's something different when you've made a commitment. So on Sunday, we had a whole bunch of them join the community, and we had a young couple as well in their 20s take a covenant commitment, like a life commitment, entering into community. So in all that will be lost in the age of authenticity, there's also then a hunger that emerges of, oh, I can see that there's something different. And so, while it must be easy to dismiss a lot of what happens, we like moving on and forgetting things. I think this thing of commitment and quality of commitment and belonging, because we know that one of the things that young people are looking for today is belonging, but I don't think they know that that comes about through commitment. Do you know what I mean? So maybe that's just like one tool in the belt today is, like I always say, if I've got a young person struggling to belong, I'll be like, well, what have you committed to? that will often be a place, like often the sense of this is my house, this is my home, this is my people. Making that commitment then can help with your sense of belonging and feeling part of that rather than waiting to belong to commit. It's a funny kind of thing.
Counterintuitive, really, for people today. Hey, and to be fair, if you belong to the ancient regime, just to hark right back to the beginning of this podcast, you probably didn't have a sense of I need to commit in order to belong because you were born into a whole system. So the idea of committing in order to belong is very much an age of mobilisation gift that we receive.
Well, it's great. It's good discussion, and it leaves a lot to ponder and to continue thinking about, the ways that I see little traces of this every now and then. And it's even worth you know, for you and I, Kat, to be thinking about, well, what did we have as tools back then that are still working, and what did we have as tools back then that, you know, maybe we need to upgrade in the toolkit kind of thing. So there's a lot for us to think about, but it's good conversation. And so, yeah, for everyone listening, hope it's been helpful for you, and until next time, be well.
Amen. Thanks, everyone.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.